Welcome to Inside AI, a podcast from the EPFL AI Center. I'm your host, Marcel Salate, professor and co-director of the EPFL AI Center. Each episode brings you fascinating discussions with brilliant minds from EPFL and across the global AI community. From groundbreaking algorithms to ethical considerations, from technical innovations to real-world applications, we explore the technology that's transforming our world. Whether you're an AI researcher, industry professional, or simply curious about the technology that's shaping our future, join us as we venture inside AI. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with three colleagues, two from EPFL and one from ETH Zurich, who are the driving force behind Apertus, the Swiss large language model released in early September 2025. This is a truly open and fully reproducible AI model created by the teams of Jaggi and Antoine Bosselut, both professors at EPFL, and Imanol Schlag, a research scientist at the ETH AI Center. We talked about what Apertus is and how it came to be, but also, very importantly, why it matters. Apertus isn't ChatGPT, right? And comparing the two directly makes no sense, given the vast differences in resources and goals. But it's already impressively performant, and it's just the beginning of what is hopefully an exciting journey for Apertus. Now, here's the critical point. Apertus is completely reproducible, and having a model that's fully transparent, something we can dissect, understand, modify, and build upon, is absolutely essential, especially as AI begins to permeate every aspect of our lives. Our jobs, society, economy, scientific research, education, health, you name it. We're still in a phase where, frankly, we don't fully grasp how these models work, and we remain heavily reliant on commercial providers. Now, of course, they are super important. They play an essential role. They generate revenue and capital to advance AI even further. But I think we're increasingly recognizing that relying solely on commercial interests isn't really going to be sufficient. AI is too impactful and too important for society not to have meaningful contributions from universities and governments. I think there is actually a key role of universities here to play in ensuring AI develops in a responsible way, transparently, legally, and in line with our values. And that's precisely the motivation behind Apertus. Its purpose isn't to compete with models like ChatGPT. Rather, it's really an accessible, robust, and open research tool and a basis for future applications. And then ideally, Apertus will further inspire innovation, enable others to develop their own models or build upon the model, build applications on top of it, and so on. Anyways, all of this is to say that I really enjoyed the conversation and I hope you will too. And before we jump in though, just a quick reminder, AMLD, our annual flagship AI event at EPFL, is coming up in February 2026. This will be our 10th edition, and to celebrate, we made the vision behind it even larger, and we renamed it to the AMLD Intelligence Summit to highlight the broader focus beyond machine learning. Key questions in this edition will be: how can machine and human intelligence cooperate effectively? What's happening at the intersection of AI and the brain? What are the breakthroughs in robotics? What's going on with AI-driven scientific advancements, such as new drug discoveries? What's the path to superintelligence? And many other questions, of course, and topics. Now, these are some of the most pressing questions, and we hope to get promising answers here, emerging both from research and industry at the AMLD Intelligence Summit. And beyond these discussions, AMLD also has hands-on workshops. So these are perfect opportunities to gain practical experience with AI and machine learning. And if you're interested to actually run a workshop yourself, we still have an open call for workshop proposals, which closes soon though, on September 16th. And additionally, we're always looking for partners to run specialized tracks or support the event in other ways. Our partnership document is online. It has numerous ways and reasons to collaborate with us with the AMLD Intelligence Summit, and you can check it out at 2026.appliedmldays.org. And now, without further ado, here's the conversation with Antoine Bosselut, Jaggi, and Imanol Schlag about the Swiss open model Apertus. All right, so I'm here with Martin, Imanol, and Antoine, who are really sort of the main forces behind the Apertus model that's been released. And we're here to talk about that. So thanks for joining me. So maybe, I guess the first question, right? How did things go? How was that release for you? I mean, you guys have been working on that with your teams for a long time. How are you feeling?
It was pretty stressful, I would say. I think one of the main mistakes is to put a deadline on something like this if you do it for the first time. And we definitely paid the price for it. But I think we kind of made it in time.
It was a roller coaster, I would say, yes.
I would say it was a completely expected roller coaster at the same time as well. I think we sort of knew from the start that when it came out, there would be this huge excitement where everybody wanted to talk about it and talk about what it was doing well. And then soon after, we knew that it wasn't going to be at the level of ChatGPT and that was going to come out and there would be some disappointment among some bodies. But overall, this is exactly kind of the process that's been foreseen. And now we'll start to see the interest build back up as it starts to be used for applications and downstream pipelines.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's exciting. No, I think it was a really fantastic rollout. Also, the echo, media and on social media was really great. And of course, now people will start to use it, and there will be many discussions, and that's also how it should be. But definitely, I think the especially sort of the overall goal, right? And we can maybe start by talking about that. What you were trying to do there, right? Not just provide another LLM, though that's of course going to be a critical part of it, but also the way that this is done. So maybe can you say a few words about that? Like what's sort of the unique selling point of Apertus in your view?
I think it's the whole recipe, right? It's a recipe for how to build a sovereign AI model in a transparent way, right? That it's fully reproducible and fully trustworthy, and also multilingual from scratch, right? So that Antoine has much more to say about that. But so it's a bit more about the recipe than just the final product. Like how do you do this? And hopefully sharing this with the open source community can also help others to then later build upon it and prepare for the next version and collaborate with us. So we really believe in the open source community to take this to the next step.
I think an important part is also the compliance, really, which is kind of unheard of to this extent. The fact that we have not used any legal sources, only public data, we've respected AI opt-outs, and also the fact that we have a model that demonstrates no memorization of training data using our control data. I think that should be quite an important discussion point regarding legal aspects around large language models. And we are pioneering this absolutely at a scale unprecedented before. And so really looking forward to how this will affect legal aspects in the future.
I guess we probably don't need to go one by one for every question. We'll figure out the podcast rhythm in a minute. But yeah, when we released Apertus, we thought a bit about what the title of the technical report should be, and there was this word that kind of kept popping up, which is democratizing. And I think to me, that pretty much kind of sums up what the purpose of Apertus is overall. It's really about making sure that there's at least one LLM that is for everybody. And so we specifically picked the ingredients of Apertus to really try to make that happen. Obviously people say like you can't please everybody, and there's definitely some people that won't be pleased, I guess, with Apertus, but it was really an attempt to make it so that it was available for certain communities that, often aren't really, I guess, handled by current offerings. Whether it's, as Imanol mentioned, the ones that are really serious about compliance, like they don't want to get sued. And so they really want something that's, put a lot of effort into, being in line and conformable with, regulatory compliance. Or it's, folks that want to have a model that's good in low resource languages. And so we train on a whole lot more of those than pretty much any model before. Or it's the scientific community that continually needs kind of very powerful artifacts at this type of scale. There's no completely open model that's been done at 70 billion scale trained on this many tokens before. And so, providing kind of this resource, it's sort of for all of these communities that may not necessarily have been catered to by existing offering.
And to just briefly add to that, like we have done a little effort on improving Romansh and Swiss German, and we can see that Romansh translation capabilities are much better than something like Llama 3, for example. And Swiss German, with just very minimal effort, a few thousand examples, the model became quite interesting. Like, it's a bit funny because it's not perfect, but it has some non-trivial capabilities of understanding and writing Swiss German. It sort of shows that now, if there are other efforts out there that are willing to do this for Telugu, for any other low resource language, then this is something we can incorporate in our next version of Apertus to enable further conversational capabilities in those regional aspects. Regional languages. And I mean, we're probably going to be talking a bit more about the Swiss initiative later, but this is not just a one-time thing, right? We have at least funding for 4 years. Hopefully there will be more funding even before that one ends out. And so there is enough time to have adoptions of contributions that we include from all over the world.
Yeah, oh, that's great. I mean, maybe exactly. Let's go into some of the details. Just maybe to set the stage, can you, for those who haven't really dug into the details about the Apertus, just give us a bit, the basic stats, like, okay, how large is the model, right? How long has it been trained, on how many tokens? Just sort of a broad overview that we have a feeling for what this model actually is. Any of you? I think you've all been there.
Everyone can respond, I guess, but I don't want to cut up people.
So take it, Imanol. It's all you. It's all you.
That's all right.
So it's a 70B model and an 8B model. They're both trained on 15 trillion tokens. So in this case, it's very comparable to the previous generation of the Llama models from Meta, which have had a lot of impact. And yeah, all of the data is publicly available. We've respected AI opt-outs. We've prevented memorization. The model is then, after pre-training, is going through several phases, supervised fine-tuning and aligning with human values, in particular our Swiss AI Charter. And yeah, so we released the final checkpoints. The base model, what we call a base model, is the final pre-trained checkpoint, as well as like the instruction-tuned model. And we are also releasing all intermediate checkpoints throughout the training process, but those are more interesting for researchers, really, for the 8B and the 70B. I think these are like the most important hard facts, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, I read that right? You ran it on 4,096 machines or something like that? Is that correct?
Yeah, so it was running on Alps, the supercomputer of the Swiss National Supercomputing Center. It has about more than 10,000 GPUs, but we ran on 4,096 at top. So that's about 40%, a bit more of the capacity of the entire supercomputer for 2 months is roughly the timeline we would need now, I guess, to train the model. Efficiency has improved a bit. I think in total we had a bit close to 3 months of pretty decent load on the supercomputer, because then it also includes the 8B model and some other post-training effort. But yeah, up to 4,000 GPUs on the supercomputer.
Okay, awesome. Good. And so you are very keen on sort of underlying that this is a truly open model. And I think that's probably worth digging into a little bit, right? Because already there's a bit of a confusion about what is an open model. Should we even call it open source model? Does that make sense? But you're really going much, much deeper in terms of openness. So can you maybe describe that? I guess the claim is that this is really the most open model there is. Would that be a correct claim? And if so, how?
I think, it's a big confusion about, open closed models. So there's lots of closed models that you have ChatGPT and so on. That's clear what that is, right? Because we know almost nothing about it. It's sometimes not even one model. It's many of them in a combination. So what is an open model? Like, what people mostly know is when you can download the model, that's one thing. So you can download DeepSeek, you can download Llama from Meta. These are the things people know, right? The problem with those is that you still have no idea how those were trained, right? We really don't know. We know nothing about the recipe. We don't know what decisions they made, how they filtered for appropriate content or not. We don't even know what languages they put. We really know nothing about the training process. So that's limiting a bit the trust, right? And also regulatory wise, I mean, the regulations now in Europe say that you must be transparent about what you put in your training data. At least you need to describe it, right? So we really went much further than that. We don't just describe it. We really make all the training data open, right? It's openly available. So you can check every document that was trained on, just so you know, right? Because these training documents, they influence all the values of the model, the flaws it has, the successes it has, the biases it has. If you don't know the training data, you're just completely blind. So yeah, we're not the best model, but we are completely open that you can inspect like why our model behaves this way or that way. You can verify that it's trained in a in a representative way. It's more than 1,000 languages that went in. We really tried our best to represent all global languages and communities in that training data as good as we can, and be very transparent how we filter the data, what data we used for compliance, as Imanol mentioned. And then, the languages is something we should discuss a bit more as well.
Yeah. Can I just pose an additional question there? Do you think there's fundamentally a trade-off there between openness and performance? I mean, you just said, right, okay, it's not the best model, but presumably it's not the best model because it's open, right? Is there, in a future where you said, okay, right, if somebody would just have all the resources they can possibly want to have, and they want to follow your recipe in terms of openness, then presumably that model could be at least among, if not even the most performant model. Is that the correct assumption, you think? Or are there really some serious trade-offs between openness and performance?
Oh, I mean, I would say that I don't think there's any technical trade-off between openness and performance. There is, though, for starters, an economic trade-off. As these models get a lot better and become the foundations of, full-fledged products, and where the only way to make money is to sell tokens on APIs, and you want to sell the most tokens, you want to keep the secrets to yourself so that you can have a better model internally than others. If everybody can just, spin up an open model and they're all roughly at the same level of performance, then, the people that are making all the money are just the ones that are selling the compute, which, might be the case anyway these days. And then, of course, there's this other trade-off, which comes back to the point of compliance that Imanol was making before, which is to be truly open, you need to show the data that you trained on. And what does that actually mean to be truly open? Why is the open data, super important? Well, because it allows for, a whole new set of, audit mechanisms and, scientific studies that can be made to try and connect, model behavior at the output to, the data mixture that went into the model. If all you have is that model at the end, well, you can keep poking at that model and seeing what it says, but you really have no idea about why it's responding in a particular way because you haven't seen the data that went into it. Now, are the methods that can, audit this type of data and model behavior perfect? No, not yet, but open models kind of allow that to move forward so that it keeps getting better. If you don't make that data available, then, that isn't possible. And that's where the problem comes, that there's lots of really good data that many model providers don't want to show that they've actually trained on because, either it was under copyright or it was private data that they can't share, or, they're worried about getting sued, even if it wasn't copyright, by somebody who wants to, make changes to the permissiveness later. And so as a result, almost no one ever releases the data that they trained on. And so that ends up, essentially meaning that in order to be truly open, you want to minimize this legal risk that you have. And that potentially means not training on data sources that might be quite powerful and could make the model better. So it's not a technical trade-off. It's more of an economic one and a legal one.
And it introduces a term that we recently also published about, the compliance gap. Like, what is the performance cost that you carry by being compliant? And this is something that is not 100% clear. We have made some experiments at smaller scale that show if you're compliant in the sense of, for example, not including news articles from media companies, since those are one of the strongest opponents, let's say, then we actually at small scale, we don't see any we see a very minor decrease in performance on specific benchmarks. But overall, if you replace the non-compliant tokens with, so to speak, compliant tokens from other sources that don't have this compliance issue, you see almost the same performance. And we can directly compare Apertus with Llama 3, which has very similar performance on some benchmarks, and some other benchmarks it has a much bigger gap. And there is rumors and also courts cases that are being handed around that show or claim that or indicate that some of the big tech companies have actually trained on data that they acquired illegally, so stolen intellectual property that they downloaded from obviously illegal sources and used for training. And the rumor is that this is important to actually achieve an 5 to 10% increase on some of the important benchmarks that all of the big models are being compared with each other. And that is, of course, unfortunate, but there seems to be somewhat of a compliant gap at the largest scale. I don't think media data is large enough for that, even though that for us individually is actually quite large. I think we're talking more about, library size amount of documents, as in like full-fledged books about non-fiction information.
Yeah, these pirated books. Yeah, so this is really a good point. I mean, if you are 10% worse if you train on legal data than if you just train on the illegal data. So then you might ask, why do we do this? Why are we open? So if you lose 10% performance, and I just think this is really important to at least to know, right? To show this, like, okay, where does the quality come from? Because this is a key technology, right? And so we need to understand this technology. We need to understand how LLMs work, what are the limitations and all that. That's a very important questions that the big tech companies don't care about, right? They just care that it works, that the customers like it. But there is much more that has to be done to understand this, and this is important, right? And you can just not do that if you don't have the whole package, if you don't have a model from end to end that is transparent so you can study it, right? For that, it doesn't matter that it's the very best, right? It just means that it's fully reproducible and transparent, right? And then I think that's really important for research and for trustworthy applications. So we really see this as a complementary to the commercial models. We are not competing with the commercial models.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a spectrum, actually, because some tech companies do care about it to some extent. And so there's a court case with Anthropic where then they revealed they actually bought millions of books secondhand and destructively scanned them in order to then produce training data out of them. And now this is a very different setting now, because now you have not actually acquired them illegal, you bought them. And like, to which extent does that allow you now to train a language model on it? This is something some American courts have to now deal with, which in society as well, I guess, because I don't think the law necessarily has that regulated, but everything looks like it's going to be fair use in the US at least. But in Europe, it doesn't quite look like that.
Yeah, well, fair use, but as you say, always under the assumption that whatever content you have, you've acquired it legally, which, is probably also not always a given, right? As we find out now through these court cases. No, that's super interesting. And I think Martin also, right, you're making that point, which I really think needs to be underlined much more. I mean, ultimately, we're being confronted with these models and they're really in the process of, reshaping the modern world. And we basically don't quite understand how they work. And what I think that's how I also try to think of Apertus. I mean, what you produced here is really almost like a fundamental basis on which to then ask those questions in a scientific, fully reproducible way, right? And that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And it's actually a bit shocking that that's not more talked about, but so, super happy to see that you guys are pushing forward on this. So what's up with the languages there? So it's also announced as like this extremely multilingual linguistic model, partially coming from the fact that this is a Swiss model. Switzerland is a small country with 4 different languages, so always sensitive to that. But of course, there's also this entire notion that, okay, if ultimately these models are just basically largely the best in English, then we have a bigger problem at our hands. So how have you tackled that here now in the case of Apertus, the language issue? What have you done, and what's the outcome?
I mean, to some extent, the models just display great cross-lingual generalization. I mean, you can ask the model Apertus to explain in Swiss German something like the global interpreter lock in Python, and it will explain it to you in a bit of a broken Swiss German, but Swiss German nonetheless. And so, to some extent, by being just very multilingual, you also generalize across other languages. Unless you're a very low-resource language that is very isolated from other languages, then presumably you benefit less, though. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big question is, now that this is out there, what are people going to be able to do with it? Just today I was talking to somebody who wants to use it in an educational program with Igbo and Yoruba speakers, because, we specifically trained on those languages, and that, they kind of want to see whether it could be useful in kind of this academic workshop that they're organizing with around 100 people. I think that's awesome. This is not necessarily something that others could necessarily tackle with other open models out there. And so, with these languages, a big part of what we tried to do is just make sure the model had some capacity in as many languages as was possible. So, how people usually select languages when training these models is that they use something called a language identification system, which essentially just takes documents that you find online or in another source and tags it with a language identifier, depending on what language this tiny model thinks it is. And what most people often do is that they select the languages that they want, and anything that they tag as different than those languages, let's say those 10 to 100 high resource languages they want to choose, they just kind of throw all of that data away and don't actually use it for pre-training. What we did kind of very intentionally instead is say, well, let's just keep all of that in there. And, even if on the surface, the model itself will not be fluent in those languages right off the bat. There's going to be some encoded capacity to represent those languages in the model, and maybe somebody can bring that to the surface later on. And so then, once we moved out of the pre-training and into the post-training, it was also super important to us to have like a ton of languages be represented in that post-training step, which is where you actually kind of define that conversational interface with the model so that it would again be usable by, large amounts of people. We've talked about Romansh and, Swiss German, which were, kind of languages we made sure to include in the post-training step. But in the end, there's around 149 languages that are actually included in that data. And there, we kind of look at how many examples. That's the one where there's at least 50 conversational examples in the post-training data that we use, 149 languages. And that's really just to make sure that, there's some base for that capacity to speak these languages in the model. And I think what we're going to see over the next few months is just that base is really going to provide a lot of options to people that want to develop tools or systems or applications on top of Apertus.
Yeah, because the pre-training is really the main thing, where the expensive part of the training, where 99% of the cost, where we spend these 15 trillion token stats. So in that main part, the model is actually, it's not Swiss, right? It's fully global, right? We have 1,000 languages or more in that, and all languages are equally present. It's not biased to Europe or Swiss or anything. So the whole pre-training is really neutral in that sense, right? Which is really exciting. And then the post-training is kind of something that's is easy to modify, right? People can do their own post-training. If you now want to take our base model and do a post-training for this African language or the Indonesian language there, that's perfectly fine. And that's something that people can easily do. And that's also something that we are excited about, to share the effort for the pre-training. And then later people can specialize very easily for their customization.
Mm-hmm. And how can we imagine this working? So, I mean, the general understanding, right, is that, okay, obviously you don't teach the models the language or the grammar and all these things, right? It learns just from basically all the text that it's seen. So if you presumably, right, at least as a first approximation, the more documents you have in that, or in the more tokens you have in that language, the better it will be. Does that then sort of cross-fertilize languages from the similar family? Like, for example, you mentioned Swiss German, which is obviously a German dialect. That presumably, or does it benefit from the fact that you have much more data in German? Is that the case? Because that could also mean, right, that investing just in some languages that are part of a family could be something worth doing in the future as well, for to sort of preserve, in quotes, right, many more of those rare languages in these models. Or am I totally off here in my reasoning?
No, you're not off. It sometimes can then also lead to leakage, where then the model might sometimes respond with a high German word instead of an appropriate Swiss German word, right? But technically, like, it just needs much less to improve the performance in that low resource language. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so that's super interesting, I think, this language aspect. Now, let's maybe dig on something other that you have mentioned before, which is this memorization prevention, right? That seems really super, super interesting, because that seems to be one of those, $1 million questions. Well, presumably it's actually going to be a $1 billion question at some point soon, if it isn't already, which is, okay, how do you prevent these things from memorizing things? And of course, there's, as you mentioned, the issue with copyrighted data, but then there's also, of course, the issue with personally identifiable information. And so how have you tackled this? I think you mentioned this Goldfish approach. Can you explain a bit how that works, and just in general the approach you took here and what you found?
Yeah, I can give a brief intro. So the Goldfish loss is almost like a joke paper that was already released a few months ago by some researchers in the US. It's called the Goldfish loss, and it's actually a very simple technique. And they were joking about it, not even worth a paper, but they saw a great effect of preventing the verbatim memorization of training data. And we have validated the results and scaled them up to 70B and seen great results at 70B as well. And the method is fairly.
Just to interject, how was it a joke in the beginning? That I don't understand.
Well, it's because the method is extremely simple. So it's almost like, it seems like almost not worth writing a paper about it, because you could explain it in a sentence with the proper background knowledge. But then, to be honest, there have been other papers like Thinking Step by Step, for example, which also had like probably even less of a technical contribution. But the Goldfish loss is very similar, because it's the regular loss that we use for training the models, but we just drop tokens. We drop the losses from certain tokens for a certain amount of a certain context. So if there is a repetition of tokens, then we will have them as a hash. And if that hash appears again at some point, we will mask that same token with a certain probability. So you have, when you pre-train a model, you predict the next token for every token in your sequence. And your sequence, typically, when you pre-train, you train on shorter sequences such that you can really parallelize a lot. And so if you have a sequence of 4,000 tokens, then you also have 4,000 predictions that you can then train the model on. And you want to train on all of them, because if you halve it, then you need to train double the amount. So the number of tokens that you need to train on is really the number of tokens that you predict. And so what you can now do is you can actually drop about 2 to 5% of those tokens from the prediction. And the model, even if it's been trained on the same document, on the same sentences over and over again, will not be able to reproduce the data that has been trained on, because the same token is always dropped out in that context. And so when you then generate data with that model, then there will come this point where the model actually hasn't memorized what it was, and then they will change the context of the model sufficiently such that the generated sequence very quickly diverges from the data that was actually used to train.
Mm-hmm. And is that like, how do you foresee that in the future? I mean, presumably, so I guess the question I have is it imaginable that a model provider will ever be able to provide some guarantees about that? Or will it always remain essentially a best effort probabilistic commitment that you can make? Because that seems to be, for some applications, at least from the way the current legal system is set up, and that also will perhaps need to adjust, is like, you can either give this guarantee or we're in big trouble, because, that one case where you divulge sensitive information is basically the end of your business in the most extreme case. How do you think about this these days? I mean, obviously, again, for an academic model, your constraints will be different, but just from a technical perspective, as you now made some progress there, what do you think the future holds in that regard?
Theoretically speaking, you could guarantee this, because there are tokens that are just never shown to the model. And so the model won't be able to memorize those tokens. And so you could make that claim that theoretically, well, those are never learned. Now, that might just be a small part of the data as a whole. But when you then actually try to generate, we do see that it diverges very quickly. And so there you can also make a probabilistic claim. In reality, it's a bit more nuanced, because we have like these hashes that we use to decide if this is a token that we have previously decided to drop or not to drop. But this hash is not perfect. So if there are slight differences, then the hash would also be different. And so these slight differences can appear in the text as it is being reproduced maybe throughout the web. This could be because of encoding issues. It could be because there was a new line suddenly, and that's now how the data is represented. And now having this new line in there means now that this is now essentially considered a different hash, and now maybe it's not dropped. And so with the Goldfish loss, we do still see some outlier samples that are memorized in our control group. But those are things like the American Constitution is quite popular, the Bible, or like phrases, entire paragraphs from the Bible, and examples like that, licensed text as well.
Yeah, the reason we're talking about this, of course, is this big legal question, right? That is when the LLM reads something, learns on something, is that is it making a copy of it? Can you make a copy when it outputs it, right? And that's a very important legal question also for the regulation discussions now going on, right? And that's exactly why we try to do this technically to avoid this. Like Imanol said, like every 50th word is just not there, so you can never continue more than 50 words like perfectly memorized. So that's nice. So it's really a kind of we think this is best practice from a technical side to avoid memorization, right? And then, I mean, the same question will then come up for image models again. Like if image models are trained on certain images and then maybe produce images on a similar style, right? Then that's actually a more difficult question. It's not so clear how similar is the style, right? For text, things are kind of easy because you can say, okay, the thing has producing some stuff from the Harry Potter book, right? That, I mean, you have to be careful that will be illegal, right? But if it's just a short snippet, it's okay. A sentence is okay, but a whole paragraph is not okay, right? And that's exactly why for text, I think we put some best practices there. And I think it's also a good concrete example that, hey, okay, of course we need to have some regulation and be clear that we respect the law. And here is how we did this for text. So Apertus is purely text to text. And then, when the next question comes for video and audio and all that, then we have to reconsider this question.
But I think it's mainly people outside the LLM community that are thinking of the models potentially as like a big database, because that's the amount of computer science knowledge they have. And I'm not judging them for that. But within the community, it's clear that these models are at worst stochastic parrots, which essentially just stochastically spew out things that they've seen during training, and at best actually are capable of producing new things that are generalizing beyond of the training distribution.
Yeah, but of course that knowledge thing is sort of the first intuitive probing, right, that you do with a system like that. Even though, of course, as you say, it's not a database, but it seems like, I mean, the intuitive hunch is that, well, if it can't even get that right, then the other things like what you mentioned, right, being creative, being, reasonable, creating new things that make sense, may be completely off the table because it can't even give you a factual answer. Even though, as again, I totally get that this is from a computational perspective not necessarily the case, but it's somewhat understandable that people have this intuition, and this is likely not going away anytime soon, I assume.
Yeah, but I don't think the model needs to have all the knowledge in the world and know it by heart, right? Because now we have models using tools, right? The models, after it's trained, can use a tool. It can do a Google search, right? I think that's the future, right? That's also this kind of agentic capabilities, and it's very important because you need to have some up-to-date information, which is, we got criticized a lot that our model is bad on who is the president in 2025 today. And it's just people don't realize this is a base model. I mean, it's the latest knowledge it has seen is like almost 2 years ago. Or 1 year ago. It's spring last year. So this is a base model, and the base training, the pre-training, right? What is that? It just means to learn the basic reasoning, basic knowledge to do that, right? It's not to memorize every little fact, right? So that can come later, and that's also something people often forget. And also all the commercial models you have, of course, they can do all this crazy tool use and Google and do that. And then if you just compare that with our raw base model, that's not a completely fair comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's somewhat unavoidable because, I mean, people just use technology in their daily lives, and that's just the standard. And whether it comes from research or not, right, this is then not really the question. But, it wasn't also meant as a criticism for that, just like as a basic understanding of how this works and what you're trying to achieve. So maybe let's switch gears here a little bit. We talked a lot about pre-training, but Imanol also, and Martin, you mentioned post-training, and you've been doing quite a few interesting things in that regard. You also mentioned this Swiss AI charter. So I'm curious to learn a bit about, what was your approach to post-training, and what is this chart? What role does it serve, and how did you come about that?
So post-training in general is all about forming the model. It's like almost like a behavioral training. I actually quickly did the math with respect to our post-training that we did. It's about 0.03% of the compute if you include pre-training in that. So it's not necessarily about teaching the model new things. The knowledge is sort of collected from other places from during pre-training, but it's where you form what the model responds or how the model responds. And it's also where you then kind of inject the ideology. Because if the model is now being conversational or trained to become conversational and responding to questions, you don't want it to give answers to every question in a sort of a pragmatic, neutral way. Like if someone asked about what is the most efficient way of killing myself, then like you don't want the model to give pragmatic advice. You want it to give advice that is ideologically flavored, and that depends on the ethics that we have. Nowadays, this is actually quite the same, more or less the same throughout all of the models that are out there. Even the Eastern models, they're very much like the Western models. They're all about being honest, being harmless, and being helpful. But you very quickly get into more details. And so there are some excellent models to help judge which response is preferred. And so we use some of these black box reward models, as we call them, to judge especially prompts that are ideologically neutral, let's say. But for prompts which are kind of more ideologically flavored, they are going through a slightly different process, which is more similar to the approach that Anthropic had with its constitutional AI approach, where you take an LLM as a judge together with a document of principles to then decide if a particular answer is supported by the document of principles or not. And this document of principles in our case is the Swiss AI Charter, where we built on sort of Claude's constitution from Anthropic, who did a first example of this, but we updated it to the current generation of large language models, which are instruction following, and also includes some Swiss flavor in it, although there are very universal principles that we included.
And who created that charter?
That was created by me together with Elliot Ash, and we refined it, and we are open to refine it as we continue in the future.
Okay. So because that seems like also super important, right? I mean, there's a lot of this discussion about, what are these models like, right? What sort of values do they have? What sort of cultural norms and ideas do they have, and do they talk about? And so I think now that you take this charter approach, that's super interesting. Can you imagine that that this could one day become quite big and large as sort of countries start to wake up to the fact that, in the context of what increasingly people refer to as cognitive warfare or other terms, that they need some assurance that the models that they use, right, comply with certain values that are as you say, relatively general, but nevertheless, I guess at times relatively unique to a particular geographic region.
Yeah, so I can't comment on the future and how it will evolve, obviously. And maybe we actually wanted to also include, let's say, more experts in this domain, but we just basically didn't have the time for it. Although I'm quite proud of what we achieved, and I think we did a pretty good job. It probably should be refined as we move forward. And it may be refined for the cultural context in other countries if necessary, and if they think that is necessary. Right now, it's not a big issue at the moment, because more or less all the models have more or less the same principles, which are more or less universal, helpful, honest, and such and so forth. But I wouldn't be surprised, because the models are already quite resilient right now to change. So if you want to get like suicidal advice, it's going to be very hard to get out of the current models. So this is something we can do pretty reliable already. And now this opens the door of having principles in there which are maybe much more political and much more strategic, where the model may at some point does not provide you with strong advice, or actually even declines to support you if you are in a particular use case. So already now, for example, if your use case is clearly criminal, most of the models will refuse to help you. But maybe in some future setting, a model that is coming out of a particular country will refuse to help you if you're trying to do something that is against the interest of that country. And this is a reality we might move towards if we don't have alternatives from other places. And this is where something like this charter, which already is building on, for example, Claude's constitution, which was more for the previous generation of LLMs, is a start, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And how do you avoid bias, right? That's sort of in every discussion about AI models. That's sort of the one of the top three concern. Oh, I heard models are biased because they're training on data that's historic, and therefore it's historically biased, and therefore, right, these models actually help to continue these biases into the future. What's the response there these days? What's possible technologically in terms of avoiding bias?
But these models are always biased, and I'm sure Anton and Martin would agree with that. The principles in this charter are all about bias. It's the bias that we care about, is how we want, what are the things we are valuing that we would like to see the model to respond. And it's about choosing in the end. It's not about removing bias. I don't think that you can really do.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's for the post-training, as Imanol said, right? But by the way, the charter he mentioned was actually verified with a lot of people, like several dozen were representatively chosen to say that, yes, we agree with that charter. So it's not just something random. But the interesting thing is also most biases actually come from the pre-training as well, right? And there it also gets interesting. There's this story that there's Russian propaganda on the web, right? And then that gets into the pre-training data, and that's true. And this is very risky, right? Because in the future there might be much bigger misinformation campaigns from all country X to country Y and so on. It's just important to be aware of that. And I think one thing that's for sure a first step is to at least make that visible, right? To at least give transparency. Hey, look, yes, there's maybe a small problem, but we know it's coming from this pre-training data, and we show it to you. You can inspect, you can audit the data, you can see how much we have from each of these domains, right? So you can actually audit the model to see like how biased it is in that sense. And I think that's the first step. And for that, we need some open models. Again, that's something is impossible to do with a commercial model. It's also impossible to do with a model where you only have the weights, but not the training data. So.
Yeah, we're talking about bias now. We were talking about memorization before and copyright issues. There's no kind of shortage of negative behaviors that people have discovered with these LLMs. And, it's tough to kind of completely get the risk of any of them down to zero. I'd say right now what's going on in LLM development is a bit like the Swiss cheese method in airline safety, which is like, you're going to fail in some places. But the key is, can you put enough slices of cheese together such that there's no path through the block? And so we do interventions at the pre-training data level. For example, we run what are called toxicity filters on the data, which essentially look for some of the most horrible things that can be said about people or groups of people online. And if we find documents that just have too much toxic content, we kind of throw away kind of a fairly large chunk of that tail. And that includes a lot of biased information. This is, when it comes to memorization and copyright, we say we only train on public data. What does that mean? Well, that means that one, we throw away all private data. It also means that we throw away all of data where in the web crawls where the content owners have opted out of having their data used for AI crawling. We go back in time, we remove all of that. And then, at the training level for memorization, we use things like the Goldfish loss. In post-training, we use things like the AI charter. We also have examples of refusal training where we specifically for certain types of queries, teach the model specifically to say, no, I'm not going to answer that. And there's just this incredible pipeline of places where we try to make these safety interventions in the middle. Now, do we, always get it right? Right now, no, but that's, where we're going to keep making progress in this area. And I would say that one of the things that's really interesting about the open approach that we've taken is that not only do we kind of integrate these methods in the model, but we kind of release, everything that makes us make that decision up until that point. So if you look at the tech report that we have an entire section kind of studying, hey, here's the impact of using the Goldfish loss, on memorization on small models. Imanol mentioned the compliance gap before. We wrote an entire paper that's going to be presented at Column in Montreal in a month that talks about, hey, here's the performance of these models when they're trained on compliant data versus not. We have, I think, a ton of graphs that show for the post-training, we throw out everything that's not licensed permissively to be used. And we kind of measure, okay, well, what's the drop in performance when you actually use purely permissively licensed post-training data as opposed to not? And so that allows people to kind of, think about these decisions and future development about, all right, what is the trade-off between really safe interaction, licensed data, performance, and all of these things that kind of come together to create these very complex systems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you just mentioned that report, right? And you also, I'm looking at it now. It's like over 100 pages, and presumably in the future it'll get even longer. This is great. And in terms of, and of course we'll link to it. So in terms of the evaluations that you've done, what have you found there? Like if today, I know it's you always say, and rightly so, right, that this is not obviously a commercial grade model right away, and that was never really the goal. But if you compare it to other open models, like how did you evaluate the model in the first place, and then you presumably also did some comparative evaluations against other models that are sort of similar in spirit, and what did you find there?
Yeah, so evaluations is a mess.
Yeah, I was about to say
everybody.
The same thing. It's a huge pain point. Sometimes some evals are also just so messy that, like, if there's a white space in a wrong place, then suddenly the model's performance completely drops. And it's for actually predictable reasons. And in some sense, it's the evaluation method that is a bit awkward, but it's what people are doing now. And so, it's a huge mess and a huge pain point, actually. And we're lucky that we had such great people on the team that were able to get this working to the extent that we have now. And we're also very lucky that there has been a huge open source effort in this space. In particular, we've been using LM Harness, which has been a good starting point, but had still required a lot of effort to get working well.
So in some sense, you're saying this is like university rankings. Everybody knows it's not really a good measure, but kind of everybody has to play the game. Is that it?
It's also a bit whack-a-mole. You're trying to improve one thing, and then the other thing goes down. It's really like it's a bit unscientific at this point, and there are still quite costly experiments, because if you do it at like an 8B scale, which is pretty fast for the whole training and the evaluation, because evaluation also takes significant resources and time to do. If you then do it at 70B, the reaction is completely different, because the 70B has a very different feel to it. It's much smarter also. It has also a much better understanding of its own uncertainty. And this is one of the many things that comes with scale.
I think in general, if you were to try to, explain to some listeners, or just, a person walking around the street outside, hey, here's how we get the numbers that lead these LLM companies to raise billions of dollars in funding, they would be appalled. It's kind of crazy. I mean, typically what is done is that there's a set of data sets, benchmarks, as we call them, that you kind of aggregate together, and you kind of run the model on all of those. And as Imanol mentioned, like, little things and how you present the question from the benchmark can change the score that you get. And then you have like aggregation. So some of these benchmarks are for, following the instruction that the model is given. Others are for, manifesting the right type of knowledge, the right information. Others are for showing reasoning. Others are for showing safe behavior. And, you pretty much kind of, use these as a point. And the thing is, the problem is that there's easy ways to get high scores on those benchmarks in what I would say is a bit shady manner. You can generate a whole bunch of synthetic data that is similar to these benchmark questions and train on that synthetic data. We didn't do any of that because, well, to be honest, if we were going to release all the data that we train on, we felt that would look bad. So we didn't go ahead and do that, and it was against our principles. We don't train on the data, on the benchmarks themselves. And so, yeah, naturally, at the end of the day, on some benchmarks, our scores are perhaps a bit lower than other models, but at least when people look at the data that we train on, it's obvious as to why that is. It's because we don't do any sorts of tricks along the way. We can't necessarily say that, other people do some of these tricks, but unfortunately we don't necessarily know, because that data is not made available for public auditing as well. And seeing just how, I would say, fickle, some of these benchmark scores can be to minor interventions, I would guess that, getting consistently very high numbers, doesn't necessarily require, but is definitely aided by training on data that looks quite similar to it.
But just to say that, yeah, we don't need to hide. We did also in those benchmarks after as Antoine said, like after you make it properly measured, we do quite okay among the open models, right? I mean, and even among the ones which are closed training data, right? So we are better than Llama's 3 8 billion by a significant margin, right? And that's we're quite proud of that, right? Because because Llama is prioritizing only English, because Llama is trained on illegal data to some degree, right? so it's nice, right? And it was not, there was a bit of a gamble, right? Like how much do we lose by being compliant, and then how much do you lose by having more languages, and then yeah.
The 8B is particularly strong, and like in big industry players, they have entire teams centered around benchmarks. They have like a team of 10 people. Their only objective is to add training data that improves the performance on this particular benchmark without cheating. And without cheating is not really black and white, actually. This is a bit of a spectrum, because you could, for example, and we've actually found some of these examples by decontaminating our data more thoroughly, which is that you could have a question about the determinant of a matrix, for example. And then we found the exact same question, but in a different language. And if you have that one of the two in your training data, then it's very likely that you will do well as well on the other one, because all that is required is now to not actually solve the problem, but to just kind of memorize that example and have the language generalization. And if you don't want to do that, then you could just add a whole bunch of examples in this space. And there's also one benchmark that measures the models being like, to which extent is the model able to follow instructions. But the instruction following breadth is actually quite narrow. It's mostly about style. And it's to some extent also synthetically generated. And so that means you have about 5 different styles that you combine. Some of things are combinatorial, but like if you now put a few people on this and you generate enough data around this, which you now can also do synthetically with big models, open source models, for example, you can train on output of a DeepSeek model, for example, which is quite excellent in some of these tasks. And you then add that to your pre-training data. I'm very sure you can get very good numbers on this benchmark. And that's also why these benchmarks have been saturated many of them have been saturated. And so it needs something more important, something more interesting than that. And that's usefulness in the real world and how it feels. And that's something you cannot easily benchmark in a lab.
Yeah. And that will.
Yeah, that's a great point there. I think it's good to reiterate. You know, at a certain point, the benchmarks diverge from what the expectation of human interaction would be. And you know, if you keep trying to like push on those benchmarks, you might end up with a model that actually doesn't really deliver or can't deliver on a user experience because it's been hyper optimized to get these improved scores.
No, makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's further switch gears to infrastructure. So you had access to this Alps computer, which is in total over 10,000 GPUs, but you said you had only in quotes access to 4,096. Give our listeners a bit of an idea what that actually means, because 4,000 is just a number, right? Is that actually a lot? Is that little? Is it academically speaking a lot? Is it commercially little? Where do you stand with this Alps machine?
There's different ways of how you want to look at it. Like one example I like to tell is that the GPU itself needs about 700 watts. If you add the CPU as well, maybe it's a kilowatt. So that's about what a toaster needs to make a toast or a hairdryer. So 10,000 toasters. Imagine 10,000 toasters in one room. I'm not sure who's going to eat all the toast, but maybe it puts a little bit into perspective now if you distribute it across 10,000 households, for example. Also, 10,000 of these 1 kilowatt things, that's 10 megawatts. And the trains, as we learned from our CSCS engineers that we have here in Switzerland that go through the Gotthard Tunnel, for example, once they go at full speed carrying the entire train, that reads about 5 megawatts. So 2 of those trains alone at full speed are equivalent of the cluster at maximal load. And this seems like it's a lot if you compare it to like the energy consumption of an individual, but that's because individuals consume extremely little energy. Like if you compare it to the energy consumption of Switzerland as a whole, of industry, maybe you want to compare it to CERN, it's minuscule. It's not even close. And that is, it's kind of sometimes difficult to put in perspective.
Okay, but that's the energy angle, and that's very important. And thanks for illuminating that. But if we just look at the like pure number of machines, right? Is for you as an academic group to have access to 4,000 machines, right? Like, how does one? If one doesn't work in this area, right? One has no idea what that means. That could be a lot. That could be a little. Where would you position that so that
Oh, I
people can
mean,
better understand that?
for academics, we have to say we are extremely lucky to have this machine, and also for Switzerland as a whole, we are extremely lucky, and the reason is that this machine was bought before the big hype of ChatGPT, right? So before AI became hot, right? So if you would buy the machine now, you would easily pay 4 times more, right? So and this is paid by the Swiss taxpayer. We have to be aware of that, but in that sense, it's really lucky that this machine was bought at that time, so there was good foresight by the supercomputing center in Lugano to get that, and then everything came together with the right timing, right? That there was exactly this GPUs which turned out to be useful for LLMs right at the time when LLMs became such an important topic, right? So that's great. So in terms of academics labs around the world, we are in one of the best situations worldwide, we can say that. But then the other hand is like compared to industry, that's a whole different picture. There we actually look pretty bad, right? And it's kind of shocking that like the big corporates are investing orders of magnitude more, right? Like Facebook and XAI and Google and Meta and OpenAI. It's so many. This is all like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more. Like you running trainings on at least 100,000 GPUs, where we used at maximum 4,000, right? We did not use 4,000 the whole training. That was just the peak usage. It was more like 2,000 in most of training. But so yes, the investments in industry are way bigger, and that's but it's also important to be aware of that and to try to measure the difference and to try to understand, is it just scale that's all you need, or is it the algorithms being smart about the data, trying to understand how it works? So that's why I think it's important to do both, right? And we cannot compete with the big industry players, but we can try to understand what's happening and try to do science for this and try to have some open models for the open source community.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we've spoken a lot about training and learning, but always in the context of machines. But presumably, what you were able to do here also has quite important implications, right, for training and learning of the students. I mean, at least that's how I imagine it. Is that correct? I mean, I guess, how would you ever learn to do this at that scale unless you're at one of those companies, right? But as a university, as a student at a university, that seems to be a pretty unique opportunity, right, to learn how to do that. Did you have students involved there as well? I think you developed a course after, is that right? Specifically for that?
There were a few students involved, 1 or 2. No, actually, 90% of our team is students. That's crazy, right? I think
PhD
I'm not sure
students.
people are aware of
And some master students
PhD
as well.
and master students, right?
Postdocs a lot as well.
It was really remarkable, right? So most of them are kind of spending their time on it just kind of voluntarily, and I mean agreeing with their advisors and so on. But this was amazing, right? That which also a bit hard to organize then, because we don't have any power of them. We're not directly paying these students, so they do whatever they want. It was really difficult to organize. But the fact that students did join and could help this so much was nice, not only to educate them, but also to see that they can get this new knowledge so quickly and that it is possible. I think we only had 2 full-time engineers, right? Everything else was basically students as well.
I mean, if you count me as an engineer, I guess, which I'm technically not, but 2 to 4, I would say, engineers now towards the end.
And 1 to 2.
And we want to expand this as well, because there are some lessons learned here. One of them is that we need some more engineers that, take care of things that are just not as sexy for PhDs and postdocs. And we also had the setting where certain ownership was given to a postdoc or PhD, and then promises were made, and then things didn't live up to it. And then like, it's not always easy. And you were mentioning a course. So we do have a course here at ETH that I'm developing. It's called the Large Scale AI Engineering. And it's a course where we actually talk about model parallelism, how to train models distributed in a distributed setting on the supercomputer itself. So we give access to the students to the supercomputer. We've had a lot of PhD students and even postdocs actually registering for the course as well to learn more about this and get a head start in working with this infrastructure. And we're expanding this quite a bit at ETH now, and we're hoping to also expand this to EPFL in the near future.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I mean, I one thing I'd add beyond that though is just the incredible educational opportunity that a project like this provides to all the people that are on it. Obviously we talk about courses and we talk about the PhDs and postdocs, but a huge just source of contribution was just kind of master students as well who wanted to do kind of projects related to this. And obviously the compute and, pre-training the model is kind of one part of that. But if you kind of look at I guess it'll be out in a few days, but if you look at like the contributions of the people that worked on the model, once you've kind of figured out the pre-training and the scaling, you kind of push a button and it goes. And the going is actually quite a quite a rambunctious process. But all the work that kind of comes before that in kind of selecting and curating and cleaning data and setting up evaluations and kind of doing algorithms for post-training, obviously you can set up research projects, smaller research project with students to do that. But I think that when you connect that back to like the whole kind of big project and the big attempt that's happening, it just kind of synthesizes things like so much clearer to the students. It just makes these connections that are really tough to make if you're just kind of like segmenting things like they do in a lot of other places that don't have this big machine because they can't get that central training effort going. And I think being able to connect, these individual parts that the students work on back to this big whole is actually like such an important learning experience for them as well to see how it all comes together.
And infra, we forgot to mention, the infrastructure struggles we had at the beginning to even just start training efficiently. Like it took us quite a while, and also the CSCS engineers, which were actually probably the ones that should get the most credit for this, to really get like efficiency stable, not fluctuating, and up there, like higher up, and like engineering wise, the ones we mentioned before were maybe the ones who were more revolved and in part of the application layer, the data collection, the actual training runs. But the CSCS had like maybe a dozen engineers that were crucial to the effort, and that are also listed in the paper. And we have an entire section about infrastructure where they share some of their learnings as well, which are probably going to be very interesting to some of the HPC people in other sovereign AI initiatives that are popping up now all over the place.
Yeah, I think there obviously there's also a lot of misunderstandings. I mean, it's not just that you put in an order for 4,000 machines at nvidia.com and then they show up and you plug them all in and you're ready to go, right? That's not quite how it works.
Not at all.
Okay, good. So maybe that's also a good moment to say a few words about actually the broader context, because this is part of an initiative that's called Swiss AI, which you are very involved in, and where Apertus is one project, but there's other foundational models that are being trained. And perhaps most interesting also to listeners is that's actually not a closed affair, but something that is quite open also to the outside world if they're interested in. So who wants to make the pitch for what you guys are doing with Swiss AI, which is also amazing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so Swiss AI was, sorry, what was that, Marcel?
No, I was just, because nobody was answering, I was selecting somebody, but go for it.
I mean, so Swiss AI is essentially a kind of a research initiative amongst many institutions in Switzerland, from obviously the two Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology, but with researchers across universities, across haute écoles, in some cases across research institutions as well, and other organizations. It's really a collective to try to build the foundations of foundation models such as Apertus, but in a variety of different fields. And so, in addition to the success that was the Apertus project this year, there were other models that came out last year, such as GEM, for egocentric models of vision that were quite good at being able to generate videos. And I hear that they've actually got a a next version coming out very soon, which is quite exciting. There are folks that were working on foundation models for weather modeling, foundation models for biomedicine, foundation models for health. And the goal of Swiss AI is to really be able to provide the compute resources to support, these ambitions that these researchers have, both with, time on the Alps machine, but then also funding that they can get to hire personnel to do outreach, whatever activities are the most important for their project. And that, yields some projects that can have groundbreaking potential, such as the ones that I mentioned. And we try to, have a project call every 6 months where, something like 12 million hours of GPU compute are given out and 2 million francs worth of project funds. It's really one of the kind of the most, I guess, consistent large scale funding opportunities that pops out every year here in Switzerland. And last year, as you mentioned, we made the decision that rather than kind of try to keep it all internal to a select group of people that had launched the collective, we would open it for applications from, anywhere in Switzerland and anywhere in the world, as long as they partner with some Swiss PI in order to drive that project forward. So it's really an incredible opportunity to do R&D at a much larger scale than is typically done in most academic and nonprofit settings. Of course, if you work at Google, it's probably not as interesting. But, apart from that, I don't think there's an opportunity like it anywhere else in the world right now.
Mm.
Yeah, people can submit any project ideas super quickly, and then you get an answer within 2 months for the large grants, and even faster usually if you do a small grant idea, if you submit something. So it's nice because the field is moving fast, right? So you need a bit fast processes to get the fresh ideas onto this machine, and it's also nice to collaborate, right? Because as we said, we have great resources in Lugano, so that's an incentive to collaborate together. Yeah, this shouldn't be used by a single lab, but that's why the large grants people can submit, they should also have a collaborative component.
And I want to just add a comment here regarding how amazing this really is, because having 10 to 15 million GPU hours to give away for research is incredibly valuable. This sort of resource from a hyperscaler or something like that would cost you between $6 and $10 per GPU hour. And so this is really a tremendous amount of value that is given away for research. And it's particularly because you get many of these GPUs together with a high performance network. So it's not just the individual GPU that counts, it's the system as a whole that you get. And this is I don't know of any other initiative that provides such amount of resources for this sort of research. And we hope that we'll see similar things popping up now with these AI factories coming up all around Europe. But so far, this has probably been the largest, at least to my mind.
Yeah. Great. So what's next for Apertus? I mean, you mentioned it multiple times, right? It's like this is just the first step, and I think that's important to underline, because there's sometimes this impression, okay, now Apertus is here, and what is it? Well, okay, that's a reasonable question, right? But don't think of it as a final thing, right? I mean, if I understand it correctly, the way you're thinking about it is very much the first step. First step is always the most important, but there can really be an amazing path forward with Apertus. So what are sort of the dimensions along which you're thinking? Martin, you mentioned some of you, I forgot two, but multimodality was mentioned, images and so on, reasoning was mentioned. So what's top of your list? Where is this heading? Long term and short term and long term, if it goes the way you want to.
Many things, yeah, you mentioned a few. So I think Imanol wants to mention the reasoning project as well, and I maybe can mention the architectures part, trying a mixture of experts. That's a short-term step, and many longer-term steps as well, right?
Yeah, with mixture of expert, the thing is it's a bit more challenging to run efficiently. So this is something we're evaluating. This gives us an opportunity to kind of demonstrate what is the largest we could train. Not that we're actually going to do it, but at least then we can make an estimate of what is actually realistic on the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is not perfect. In particular, it has 4 GPUs per node, which means that you need to actually shard the model much more compared to other that industry is using. Some other things I would like to mention is the thinking capability, the reasoning capability. So this is a natural next step that is now almost battle tested. Sort of emerged at the beginning of the year and now has become a sort of standard. This is something we've already been working on before the release, and we will continue, and we might have something fairly soon. And something else that is important to us is to support some key domains. In particular, the health domain, following a bit the steps of the Meditron project at EPFL, which we are also very much collaborating with. The educational domain, in particular, how generative AI can be used, not just to support as a tutor to support students, but also to support lecturers in helping to grade and assess students. This is, for example, something that has been going on quite a lot at ETH with the ETH project, which we are looking into as well. And we want to make sure we can actually support them as well to make them fully independent of tech companies. And the third one is legal/governmental domain, to make sure the model can also be harnessed in our Swiss institutions, such that we also give back something to the Swiss society by supporting the Swiss government. For all of these, in particular for the first two, it's important that the model has a certain capability to understand image inputs, to understand images, and maybe also audio. And this is something we are exploring right now, but it's a bit more of a tricky question, in particular because we do likely want to have a generative objective because of its effectiveness, but we're not that interested in producing a model or releasing a model that can generate images and generate audio, because we're very well aware that they also have some misuse potential, and the legal situation is a bit different there. For example, memorization becomes a much more finicky detail because it's not about pixel-wise perfect reproduction. It becomes now visual similarity, and you have things like trademarks, which are all issues that we don't really have in text, or at least not to the extreme extent. And so we think we have a nice solution in petto to enable it and do this efficiently at the 70p scale in a way that is actually not done before. And we're very excited about releasing that soon, but we won't put a date on it for obvious reasons. And so we have a few things definitely in mind to improve. On the more short term, we are looking at reducing the memory footprint of the model by quantizing the model to like FP8. This is actually something that has we've already been testing out with our deployment partners, such as Swisscom. And that would be really amazing, because then the 70p model, which takes about 130 gigabytes, would literally half in memory requirements. And that means you can actually put it on a single latest or newer generation GPU. And that makes it just much more scalable and useful for different practitioners, such as research engineers at the different universities, for example, from where I got this particular request. And so we're really looking forward to keep releasing and making updates to the effort.
Mm-hmm. Is there also some effort going on into actually understanding how any of this works? I mean, it's just right. Still, one of the most fascinating aspects about these models that at the end of the day, even though right mechanistically, obviously you have a very good understanding because you create it, and so therefore, right, you understand it at that level. But we still seem to have very little idea of what's actually going on the deep inside of these models. And we see some of the research coming out from Anthropic, and I guess we're grateful that they're doing that, but. Yeah, I mean, they're also.
But it's only them.
It's only them, and it's a commercial provider. You just never know what's going to be decided at the next board meeting, or however these companies are run. So that would seem to me to be like an enormously interesting, proposition for an academic actor. I mean, I'm not saying you because you guys are busy, but is that something that's that you see people thinking about in the making, approaching you, how to better understand, and ultimately then of course also the big question about alignment. I mean, I think there's much more work there that's being done, but are those also angles you want to people see working on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two things to keep in mind there. The first is absolutely we're going to keep doing work on alignment. One way I guess to think about how this project went is that it took us about a year, and it took us about 11 months to pre-train the model and 1 month to post-train it. And part of the reason for that is that we were really focused on getting these base models out as open artifacts that others could already start building on top of it. And we should view the post-training as sort of a V1, where we put a ton of effort into, making it suitable in terms of the data sets used, the capabilities we wanted to bring to the surface, the charter of the values we wanted it to follow. But all of these are dimensions that we can keep improving, and we are going to do, quite a bit of development on that. In terms of kind of other studies on safety, we are, funding projects within Swiss AI that specifically kind of look into these things for the Apertus model. But the important thing to remember is that these, as Imanol mentioned earlier, with the 0.03% cost relative to pre-training, now that these base models are out, anybody can kind of tackle these problems with much more limited resources. And that's really kind of the strength of putting these models out there, is that now we don't have to do it alone. We don't have to necessarily be the ones that are running all of these projects with, our limited personnel here. We can really rely on a much more expansive community of folks who also want to answer the same questions. And it's really the fact the models are open that makes that quite possible. So, there's obviously the things that we're going to keep doing because we have people interested in those questions in Swiss AI, at EPFL, at ETH Zurich, and other universities and institutions throughout Switzerland. But everybody else is going to be able to tackle those same questions as well.
Mm-hmm. And what are things you cannot do because you only, in quotes, have 4,000 machines? I mean, I'm basically asking, right? Because obviously, from a strategic perspective, one always has to think about the future. And you mentioned it before, right? The pricing dynamics is quite crazy. And the reason why we're here in this lucky situation is because many, many, many years ago, right, a few people had the right ideas and the right hunches about where things are going. So even though things are, of course, now quite great, you have to plan for the future. And so there's a question whether the obvious next step would just to go even bigger, right? To say, okay, 10,000 GPUs, that's very 2023. The next one, right, has to be 100,000 GPUs. A counter argument there would be, no, I mean, now you have this model, right? And as you're saying, I mean, a lot of the interesting stuff anyways is in post-training, which needs actually fewer resources. So what's your hunch there? I mean, are there going to be things that just won't be accessible to you as sort of cutting edge researchers in this field unless you just go down the route of getting more machines?
Well, sure, this is super important. I mean, one thing you should not forget is these GPUs become worthless in only 3-4 years, right? The deprecation is so fast, right? Because they improve every year. The new ones you can buy, right? So after 4 years, you can kind of throw them away, and so they need to be regularly replaced because advancing is so fast, and at the same time, they don't only get better, but the scale that people use for AI training is increasing so fast in the industry as well, right? So that it'd be really hard to keep up, right? And to be honest, I think it's very difficult as a small country to do this alone. It might be impossible, right? So I think the only way that this might work in the next few generations is to team up with other institutions, other countries in Europe and so on, and really, put money together to do this together, right? Because this is also an idea, like this is just a proof of concept. Hey, you can train a base model like this, right? So, but the next time it would make much more sense to do it together with many other languages, many other players, many other universities, and public institutions from all around Europe. So that would be great, right? But it's difficult. I don't know if this can be coordinated politically and so on, but this would be very necessary, and it's very quickly necessary because the industry advances so fast. Also the investments, right? That already next year, I think this will be the time that this has to be done to train the next generation of model, which needs to be 10 times larger. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that it's also not just the size of the model. There is now this RL phase, this thinking training that is bottomless barrel that can consume as much resources, GPU hours, as you have with asymptotic improvements in many different areas. And so Thorsten Höfler has a very nice talk about how we are actually entering the age of compute. Compute is increasingly important in our society, and we need to make sure that we have a decent amount of compute that we can use for the research and development of this technology. And the cluster now is useful for, I'll be a bit more generous, 4 to 6 years, I would say. We also have hardware A100s, for example, that we use for inference that is basically 5 years old. But there are gaps because Hopper generation supports data types and computations that we cannot do on previous generations. And so it's also very much possible that the next generation, or the generation we use in 6 years, is going to support computations that the current hardware does not support. And then it's a no-brainer that you need the new hardware. And there I'm worried a bit about it, because we had the cheap price, the amount of money we would need now for a next generation cluster. And some of these things have to be decided now, because these orders are made years in advance. As we have seen now, it was delivered 2024 and was ordered 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And this needs commitment now, not in 6 years. And we need that commitment from the state, essentially, to support this sort of research in the future. And a good chunk of that will likely then go into a collaborative effort with other nation sovereign efforts. But it's not so simple.
Yeah, and one doesn't exclude the other, right? I mean, I think you probably still have to plan for the fact that the others may just not do it, or I think some sort of contingency planning where you say, okay, what if nobody eventually moves in that direction because they can't, or they don't get it, or they're too late? You still don't want to be in a situation where you suddenly find yourself with the back to the wall. So in that sense, it probably does make sense, right, to invest. And then, of course, if the other countries are also putting their chips on the table, literally, then that's good. And one can think about, right, how to then make the most out of the total sum, but probably not being too dependent on the others moving.
Yeah, what we're hoping, for example, is that Apertus could potentially serve as a foundation for the training of another sovereign AI effort, where they don't actually start from scratch, because but continue from where we left off. And the reasoning is that we have actually done a lot to make it as international as possible. We kept the natural distribution as we find it on the web. We have made very little, and if we have done interventions, it was mostly at the very end, and we have provided checkpoints that are even before some of these interventions that would allow another national AI effort to maybe build on the 15 trillion that we have trained now and add another 15 trillion. And then everyone could benefit from those. And then maybe a third party would then continue even further, or might use this to distill it into an even larger model to make sure that it really ramps up very quickly in its learning progress. Instead of predicting individual next tokens, it could learn to predict what like an already very well-trained model is predicting, which is called distillation. And usually that is done for smaller models, but you could also do this for a much larger model to really speed up its training at the beginning. And this is something where I think an international effort could have a strength or a power that would be very hard to rival by a company.
Yeah. Is this sort of the idea behind the often quoted CERN for AI type of vision that basically, ultimately, I mean, I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is the reason why you ultimately need a CERN is because no single institution can basically finance such a hardware, right, ultimately. And it seems like in some sense we're going in the same direction with AI. The hardware is just going to be the thing that's going to be so large and so expensive that it makes sense to put things together, with the exception that you can probably make it much more distributed than your colliders. Yeah. No clear vote for that. I'm hearing none.
I mean, I can make a quick comment because I don't know about like having a CERN for AI in one place. And this is a term that has been thrown around, but I don't think is really discussed in closer circles. There are a lot of AI factories popping up. And what we have had as part of the AI for Good event in Geneva, we had the first summit of open source model builders, where we want to come together and share knowledge, share what we have done, learn from each other, and potentially build on each other as well. And I mean, the first step is to just get connections. And this is already what we've done. This has happened this summer as part of the AI for Good event. And we hope to encourage and cater to these connections in the future as well, to hopefully maybe get to something like a distributed CERN. I mean, there are some projects going on at Swiss AI now as well, which are evaluating the possibility of training across data centers, which brings with it even more engineering challenges. And this is something that would then maybe enable multiple data centers in Europe working together to train one big model. Although I'm not so sure size is really the place you want to go, because a big model is also expensive to serve. And if you actually want to serve a lot of people, you care a lot about the cost of each individual query that is being sent to you. So there is always a trade-off as well. And this is also why we have a 7TP model. It sits very neatly in a place where performance is very good. There is precedent to it, so we can look at the compliant gap, but it's also not too large for people to serve at a price that is acceptable. And
No, makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's close this slowly. And I know, Antoine, you have a sick cat that is hoping to see a doctor any moment soon. So we definitely don't want to stand in the way of that. But yeah, so maybe just a closing round. So what is, for each of you, right, what is the learning you now take away from this process, of training Apertus and where things are heading? What do you wish? What's your like biggest take home message and sort of outlook for the future? It's a relatively generic question, but also in the sense of making it as open as possible to you. So who wants to go first?
I can. I guess I can start. And I mean, I'm probably going to give hopefully an answer that is less grounded, because there's no shortage of technical learnings here, and I think we've covered those as well pretty well over the course of this hour. But I'd say one of the things that I learned is once in a while everything kind of comes together the right way. You get people at a supercomputing center who have the foresight to invest in 11,000 chips 3 generations ahead of time and order them and put them in a supercomputing center. You get a group of researchers that come together to start a research collective on kind of doing big foundation models research, and you get kind of a subgroup of those researchers who bring together over 100 students, postdocs, engineers, researchers to kind of train a very, very big model. And these aren't often things that happen in academia just sort of naturally. But I think one of the things that I learned over the course of the project is that we can do it if we choose to, and if people kind of look at the endeavor in a slightly different way than academic institutions typically do. And I know on our end we're already gearing up for multiple threads of V2 of Apertus, and at least from what we see with these other kind of projects that are upcoming in Swiss AI, is that there seems to be sort of a phase shift in thinking about what contributions of academia towards these research endeavors and AI can be. And so I guess what I've learned is that it is possible to do this type of AI research at scale and AI development at scale within public institutions, and that's quite promising for the future, especially given the amount of resources that are being invested in it. And hopefully we can serve as an example of why that investment pays off.
Mm-hmm. All right, Imanol?
So I think this has been an incredible learning opportunity already. And I'm very excited about the idea of Apertus being a platform for research and development of the technology that will be defining our time. And I'm very excited to see how we can now collaborate with industry, with researchers in improving this technology and better understanding it and in deploying it in a responsible fashion. And this is, that basically summarizes it.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Mark?
You have almost nothing to add, like Antoine and Imanol already said everything, but yeah, go and try out our models. You can run them on your laptop even. It's very easy now. So on Mac laptops at least. So play with them. And I'm very optimistic also about the open source community, the scientific community, to build upon these things, right? We think there's some very cool things that can be done with models that are fully open, right? And looking forward to the next steps.
Yeah, and to see many applications, because that's maybe also worth mentioning, right? That's not what you try to do primarily. And that's maybe also where sometimes a bit of the confusion is. I mean, you alluded to it, right? There's a model, but then there's a whole software application around ChatGPT that is actually, extremely hard work as well. One also has to say that. And that's not where you will put your focus, but that's where the hope is that the ecosystem picks it up and creates then also amazing applications. Good, and I think we can close here, though there would be so many things to further discuss, but I'm sure that hasn't been the last discussion. Also very much like the name, by the way. I don't know if there's a funny side story there, but I'm just happy it's not somehow called, fondue or whatever, right? Sort of embarrassing Swiss name.
That's a bit cheesy,
right?
I would say.
Knowing these things, I mean, I haven't been involved, but I can only imagine what sort of names floated around. And Apertus is really super classy, so
it's actually surprisingly hard as well. Like I first thought,
naming is
for
hard.
example, when Bart was renamed into Gemini, I thought, what a stupid name. But now in hindsight, I have to say, it's actually a pretty good name. At least definitely what OpenAI came out with. And we had a few discussions with a larger group of people and a few votes as well within the community that developed it. And there were a few other options, but Apertus in the end seemed to be best representing the values of the project.
Good. Very diplomatic response. And
very consensus driven, I guess.
We'll probably keep it at that. Excellent. Okay, guys, thank you very much. All the best. I'm sure you are also happy for a bit of a break after this rush to release. And really looking forward to see what's going to happen in the time after this release. But yeah, amazing job, well done, and let's keep the conversation open.
Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Marcel.
Thanks, Marcel.
See you around.
See you.